Hello, this is Barry Schnell with Technology Foundation Group, and this is a tutorial demo on how to use the Technology Foundation Group collapsible wrapper custom component. So there's been some discussion in the community about having more control over field editor section configuration properties, and also the ability to have a collapsible section outside of a field editor, so to be able to put other types of components into collapsible areas on the screen, very similar to the way field editor sections work. And the Technology Foundation Group collapsible wrapper component is gold at solving for that scenario. So what you'll see here on the screen is four collapsible wrappers: a basics wrapper, an owner info wrapper, a system info wrapper, and a contacts wrapper. And then inside of each wrapper is a field editor section. In the case of basics, owner info also has a field editor, system information has a field editor, and contacts has actually a table component. So typically what you would do if you wanted to have sections is you'd have a field editor with multiple sections, but the custom component allows you to put anything inside of a collapsible area and also configure that collapsible area with different properties in terms of its initial state. So what you can see on page load here is that the basics collapsible wrapper is open on page load. The owner info actually isn't even collapsible, so we've turned collapsibility off, and the system information is collapsed by default as well as the contacts. But by clicking the arrow, you can obviously expand and collapse the different areas. If we go into the contacts, what you will see here is also some more features behind the custom component as far as control over the different properties that it exposes. If here's an existing contact, and when I edit that existing contact, it'll bring a pop-up in. In here is four different collapsible wrappers: a basics, a contact info, an org info, and system info. And you can see they're all displayed, and they're all expanded or open by default when you load this pop-up. If I were to add a new contact and click edit, you can see the display is very different. Three of the collapsible wrappers are not even displayed, and the basics, since it's the only area on the screen, doesn't show a header. In this case, there's no reason to show a header since it's just the only information on the screen. So based on conditional configuration, you can determine whether or not you want the header to display, if you want it to display open, closed, or conditionally based on different factors. So let's walk through how you would configure that. So on the page itself, you can see we have a collapsible wrapper, and you can find that in the TFG components collapsible wrapper. Just drag that into your page just like you would any other component. Within the collapsible wrapper itself, on the basic tab, you have some properties that you can set. You can determine whether or not you want to show the wrapper header. You can say no, yes, or conditionally. In this case, we have it configured to yes. So we will show a header. You can put the wrapper title in, and you can use merge syntax in the wrapper title. Then on the model you choose, which model do you want to use to apply to that merge syntax. Keep in mind you can always use global merge syntax. And whether or not you want the section, the wrapper, to display open by default, not collapsible, or initially collapsed. So the basics has a header and it's open by default. The owner info, you can see, has a header, but it's not collapsible. The system information is, we are showing a header and we are initially collapsed. And the contacts, we are also showing a header and we are initially collapsed. Some of the other functionality that's exposed, what you'll see up here is you have ability to style the wrapper just like you would a standard squid wrapper. You have an advanced area, so you can give it a unique ID, a CSS class. You also have actions, which are unique to the collapsible wrapper. In the terms of what you can actually define, you can define actions that occur before the first time the wrapper opens, after the first time the wrapper opens, before any time it opens, after any time it opens, before it closes and after it closes. You can see on the right hand side of the screen, it gives you a little bit of hint as to what each one of these categories does. So in the case of the contacts wrapper, I have it configured to, before you open the wrapper the first time, go ahead and query the contact model. So what this allows you to do is, in the past, if you've had an account and a contacts table, for example, on your page, you would have had to have loaded those models on page load, where in this case, because we've collapsed the contacts wrapper by default, we won't actually go load the contacts until the wrapper is opened for the first time. So if I look at my models and I look at contact, you can see that we're not loading the data on page load. Instead, we're loading it the first time that the wrapper is opened. If we go into the edit button, and if you recall from the page over here, the behavior is different between a new contact and an existing contact. Further, when I open Jack Rogers, you can see that the contact information section is open and expanded, and it displays the email, business phone, etc. If I look at Joe Smith, you can see that the contact information, it's the same pop-up, but it's collapsed by default, and that's due to conditional rendering on the collapsible wrapper itself. And we'll see how that works here in a second. If we look at the pop-up, so within the pop-up itself, you can see we're also using the TFG pop-up controller to disable the close and the escape buttons, so that the only way to actually close the dialog is to actually click the close button, so we can control the actions that occur at that point. We then have a responsive grid, and it has two collapsible wrappers. One's the basics and one's the org info. And if we look, we also have a context option. Because we're in a pop-up, you can go configure the context. So I've got the ID of the record is the ID of the row in the context, so that we pick up the correct contact. And now if I look at the collapsible wrapper itself for basics, if you recall, on a new contact, we did not have a header. So let's see how we did that. On the basics wrapper, if we go to the rendering section, you can see that the rendering options here you have the ability to configure standard squid render conditions, in which case if the conditions are true, the component itself will render, otherwise they won't, keeping in mind that if there's no conditions in there, the component will always render. You then have the ability to show not collapsible by default, show open by default, or show collapsed by default. Now, this combination of conditions works slightly differently than the render conditions. In the render conditions case, if no conditions are listed, the component will render. In the case of the collapsible wrapper, if no conditions exist, it's treated as we're not going to show it collapsible, and then it goes to the next category, show open conditions. If there's nothing in there, it will go to the next category, or if it's false, if the conditions are false, it'll go to the next category. If it goes through all three categories and it cannot find a situation where there's at least one condition and the condition evaluates to true, it will end up with the default, which is no header. So it will show the, in this case, show the open when the row is already exists in the model. And that's how we got the existing contact to have a header, while the new contact does not. Sorry, I misspoke. If it goes through all three categories and it doesn't find a match, it will not even display the header. And that's because we said we want to conditionally show the header. So if it can't find a situation where it should show the header, it won't show the header at all. So keep in mind that these conditions work slightly differently than render conditions. It has to find a category that has at least one condition and that it evaluates to true, otherwise it won't show a header. So this gives you the ability to not show a header at all, or show a header either not collapsible, open, or collapsed by default.